Eli Cole paid $1 for the chapel on the hill above Ashford Hollow, signed his name on a county form under fluorescent lights that hummed louder than the clerk's radio, and drove home in a truck that needed new brake pads more than he needed a building nobody in 3 counties would take for free. 4 months later, a masonry hammer would crack through the wall behind that chapel's altar, and what came sliding out into the beam of a work light would be appraised, weeks after that, at $475 million. On the day he signed the form, Eli didn't know any of it. He only knew the roof leaked over the choir loft, the floor sagged in a patch the size of a dinner table, and something about the place had been pulling at him since he was young enough to swing his legs off the end of the front pew and not touch the floor. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end. Something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to the morning of the closing. Frost still lay in the shadow side of the ridge, though it was almost 8 o'clock, and Eli sat in the county annex parking lot for 11 minutes before he went in, running his thumb along the seam where his prosthetic met the socket, feeling for the spot that always rubbed by mid-morning. He'd learned to check it before a day that was going to ask a lot of his leg. He figured this one would. Inside, the clerk, a heavy-set woman named Doris who'd sold him his fishing license every spring since he was a boy, slid the paperwork across the counter without looking up. "You sure about this, hon?" she asked. "That roof's been open to sky since the bicentennial." "Near enough. I'm sure," Eli said, though he wasn't. Not the way a man is sure about a thing he understands. He was sure the way a man is sure about a woman he hasn't met yet, and already knows he'll marry. It made no sense on paper. He signed anyway. Doris stamped the deed, slid him a copy, and for a second her face softened out of its official line. "Your granddaddy used to sit 2 pews back, left side, every Sunday I can remember, before they shut the doors." "I know," Eli said. "I used to sit with him." He hadn't said that out loud in years, hadn't thought of it in longer, but it came up out of him easy as breath, and he carried it to the truck like something he'd need later and didn't want to lose. Ashford Hollow sat in a fold of the Allegheny Hills where the light came late in the morning and left early in the afternoon, a town built for a coal seam that had been worked out for 40 years. At its peak, back when Eli's great-grandfather swung a pick 6 days a week, 4,000 people had lived along its one paved street and its dozen dirt ones. The company store was a hardware shop now, half its shelves empty. The school where Eli's mother had learned her letters had closed when the district consolidated in the 90s, and the building sat boarded up behind a chain-link fence the town could no longer afford to take down. 311 people still called Ashford Hollow home, according to the sign at the town line, and the number under that had been crossed out and repainted at least 4 times that Eli could remember. Always lower. The chapel stood above all of it, on a shoulder of hill just off the switchback road that used to carry ore carts down to the tipple. Whitfield Memorial Chapel, the cornerstone said, though most people in town just called it the chapel on the hill, or, if they were feeling less charitable, that old wreck. It had been built in 1911 by Josiah Whitfield, who owned the mine and most of the town along with it, and it was the finest building for 60 miles in any direction, or had been. Gray fieldstone quarried from the same hills it sat on, a bell tower with a copper roof gone the green of an old penny, stained glass windows shipped in from Pittsburgh that had somehow survived a century of hailstorms, and 2 generations of teenagers with rocks. Whitfield had built it, the story went, as a gift to the town and a memorial to his wife, Anne, who had died of a fever not long after they came to Ashford Hollow together, before the mine had made him rich enough to save her from it. Whitfield himself was buried in the small cemetery behind the Methodist church in town, under a granite marker plainer than the mausoleums rich men usually built for themselves, and if Ashford Hollow's older residents were to be believed, that plainness had been deliberate. He was not, by every account that survived him, an easy man. He fired miners for laziness, and kept the ones who worked hard through winters that would have broken kinder employers, paid better wages than most of his competitors, while running his company store tight enough to claw a fair portion of those wages back, and was, in the specific contradictory way of certain self-made men, both genuinely beloved by some of Ashford Hollow, and genuinely resented by others, sometimes within the same family. What nobody disputed, town legend or courthouse record alike, was that something in him had changed after Anne Whitfield died, and that the chapel was the clearest evidence of it anyone had left behind. Eli had heard that story his whole life the way you hear the furniture of a place, present but unexamined, until the year he turned 30 and came home from Walter Reed with one leg instead of two and nothing in particular to do with the rest of his life. That was when the chapel started to matter to him in a way he couldn't fully explain, not even to himself, and certainly not to his sister, who worried about him in the specific, exhausting way of people who love you and don't know what to do with that love, except worry it like a loose tooth. He had been a combat engineer, 12 years in, staff sergeant, 2 deployments to Afghanistan, with a stateside stretch at Fort Leonard Wood teaching younger soldiers how to find the things in the ground that were built to kill them. He'd been good at it. He'd been good at the part of the job that was math and pattern and patience, the part where you learn to read disturbed earth the way another man might read a face, and he had been less prepared for the day. On his second tour, outside a village whose name he still didn't say out loud if he could help it, when the ground read him first. He remembered the heat before he remembered the sound. He remembered Danny Ferris's voice on the radio, a half-second before, easy and unbothered, complaining about the chow that morning, and he remembered nothing at all of the actual moment, which was its own kind of mercy and its own kind of theft, because it meant he never got to say anything back. He woke up in a field hospital 2 days later with tubes in more places than he could count, and a doctor telling him, gently, the way you tell someone something you've told 100 people before, and it never gets any easier, that they'd saved as much of the leg as they could, which turned out to be everything above the knee and nothing much below it. Danny didn't wake up at all. They told him 3 days later, once he was lucid enough to keep asking, and stubborn enough that nobody could keep deflecting. A young Army chaplain sat with him for it. A captain with the tired, careful eyes of a man who had done this before and had clearly not gotten used to it. And Eli remembered almost nothing of what was actually said except the particular weight of the silence that followed, like something heavy had been set down on his chest and left there. He didn't cry. Not then. He asked, once, to see a casualty photograph he had no business asking to see, and the chaplain refused him, gently, and it would be 2 more years before Eli understood that refusal as a kindness, rather than the cruelty it felt like at the time. Danny had a wife in Fayetteville, and a daughter who wasn't yet 2. Eli wrote to both of them from his hospital bed, left-handed, because his right hand was still too swollen to hold a pen steady. 4 drafts before he mailed the 5th, and never once managed to say the thing he actually meant, which was that he would have traded places if the Army had ever let a man trade. He kept Danny's dog tags in the drawer of every nightstand he'd owned since, not worn, just kept, the way some men keep a photograph they can't quite look at, but also can't put away. On the anniversary of the blast, every year, he called Danny's widow, a woman named Rosa who had remarried by the 3rd year and always still picked up, and they talked for 10 or 15 minutes about nothing in particular, the daughter's soccer season, the weather in North Carolina, and neither of them ever mentioned the actual day, because there was nothing left to say about it that either of them hadn't already carried alone long enough to know the shape of it by heart. Eli spent the next 14 months between Landstuhl and Walter Reed and a rehabilitation center in Georgia, where they taught him to walk again, on a training leg that chafed like a bad marriage, before they finally fit him with something that worked. He got good at it, in time, the way a man gets good at anything he has no choice but to be good at. There was a Marine 2 beds down at Walter Reed named Ochoa, who had lost both legs above the knee to a pressure plate outside St. John and had, as far as Eli could tell, decided somewhere in his first week that bitterness was a luxury he wasn't going to afford himself. Ochoa taught him to play spades left-handed during the long stretches between physical therapy sessions, cheated at it shamelessly, and told him once, on a bad night in Eli's 3rd week, propped up in the dark with the hallway light cutting a yellow bar across the floor between their beds, that the trick wasn't learning to stop grieving the leg. The trick was learning to stop waiting for the grief to finish before you let yourself start the rest of your life, because grief didn't run on that kind of schedule and never had, for anybody, about anything. Eli hadn't believed him, not fully, not for a long while. He carried the sentence around anyway, the way you carry a tool you don't yet have a use for, certain that eventually you will. They lost touch the way people do after a shared ward. A handful of texts that thinned out over a year until they stopped, but Eli still thought of him sometimes, usually on days when the leg was giving him trouble, and self-pity started to look like a reasonable place to set up camp for the afternoon. The physical therapists measured his progress in numbers, degrees of range, and minutes of endurance, and the width of the callus forming where the socket met skin that had never before been asked to bear weight. And Eli, who had spent 12 years measuring the world in that same clinical way, found something almost restful in being on the other side of that kind of measurement for once. Even when the numbers were bad, he could hike a mile of rough trail if he paced himself and iced the stump that night. He could climb a ladder, though he preferred not to be watched doing it the first few times he tried something new, on account of the ladder, and on account of the part of him that still, 4 years later, hated needing to think about a leg at all. Phantom sensation came and went, mostly at night, mostly a dull electric itch in toes that weren't there, and he'd stopped mentioning it to anyone, because there was nothing anyone could do about it, and talking about it just made people's faces go soft and careful, in a way he'd come to dread more than the pain itself. The Army gave him a Purple Heart, a disability rating, and an honorable discharge, and it gave him, in the unhelpful way institutions give you things, a great deal of time. He came home to Ashford Hollow, because he didn't know where else a man goes when the only trade he knows is building things and blowing up other things, and the town he grew up in doesn't have much use for either. His mother had passed while he was still in his second tour, cancer, quick and cruel the way it sometimes has the decency to be, and his father had followed her 2 winters later in a manner nobody called cruel, because heart attacks in your recliner in front of a football game don't get called cruel. They get called peaceful, though Eli privately thought there was nothing peaceful about a man dying alone, with the volume up too loud for anyone to hear him call out, if he'd had time to call out at all. Civilian life, it turned out, did not care much about any of the numbers that had once defined him. The VA processed his disability claim over 11 months. 3 separate reviews, a stack of paperwork thick enough to double as a doorstop, and a caseworker who changed twice in the middle of it, each new one asking him to explain, again, from the beginning, what had happened to his leg, as though the file itself might have gotten it wrong the first 2 times. He applied for construction and engineering jobs across 4 counties and heard back from almost none of them, and the 2 interviews he did land both went quiet, politely, unmistakably, right around the point in the conversation where the subject of physical requirements came up, and Eli, out of some old habit of honesty he'd never managed to unlearn, mentioned the leg before anyone could ask around it. He told himself it didn't bother him. It bothered him plenty. There was a particular flavor of humiliation, he'd learned, in being 12 years a soldier who had built roads and bridges and cleared fields other men were afraid to walk across, and then spending a Tuesday afternoon being told, kindly, by a foreman half his age, that the position required frequent kneeling and they'd love to keep his resume on file. He filled the empty months the way a lot of men in his position filled them, which was not well. He fixed what needed fixing around Callie's place, because she let him, because it gave the days a shape they otherwise lacked. And some evenings he'd drive the switchback road up past the chapel just to look at it from the truck window without stopping. The way you might drive past a house you used to live in, not sure yet what you were looking for, only that you kept coming back to look. It was 6 months of that before the county's dollar house notice went up in the window of the hardware store, and Eli read it standing at the counter buying wood screws, and something in him that had been quiet a long time sat up and paid attention. That left Callie, his younger sister, married to a man named Wade Tanner who sold insurance out of a strip mall in the county seat, and who loved Eli, in his way, with the particular anxious love of a man who has never had to test his own courage, and doesn't entirely trust anyone who has. You could have put that money towards something with a roof already on it, Wade said, the Sunday after the closing, over a pot roast Callie had been cooking since noon. He said it lightly, the way a man says a thing he's decided in advance to say lightly so nobody can call him on the weight underneath it. I'm just saying, that settlement's not going to come around twice. It wasn't the settlement, Eli said. It was $1. You know what I mean. The time, the money you'll sink into it after the dollar. Wade set down his fork. That building's been condemned for what? 15 years? 18. 18 years. And every contractor in this county has looked at it and walked away, and you're going to fix it, on your own, with one leg. The table went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when somebody has said the thing everyone else was too polite to say and now has to live with having said it. Callie's eyes cut to her husband, sharp enough that Wade had the grace to look down at his plate, and across the table their boy, 7 years old and blessedly oblivious to the weather in the room, asked if there was more gravy. With one leg and 2 hands, Eli said, evenly, because he had learned a long time ago that the worst thing he could do for himself was let a comment like that land somewhere it could fester. I built worse than that chapel out of worse than what I've got now. Wade, under fire, in the dark, with people shooting at me while I did it. A roof's not going to shoot at me. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Eli speared a piece of pot roast, unhurried. I'm doing it anyway. Callie reached over and squeezed his hand under the table. Quick. The old signal from when they were kids, and one of them needed the other to know they weren't alone in a room. She didn't say anything about the chapel that night. Not one word for or against it. But she found him in the driveway before he left, and stood with her arms crossed against the cold. You don't have to prove anything to Wade, she said. I'm not. You don't have to prove anything to anybody, Eli. Not the town, not Dad, wherever he is. Not yourself. Eli looked up the ridge, though the chapel wasn't visible from Callie's driveway, just the dark shape of the hill it sat on, blacker than the sky behind it. I know that, he said, and meant it, mostly. What he didn't say, because he hadn't yet found the words for it even in his own head, was that fixing something broken had started to feel, some nights, like the only kind of prayer he still knew how to make. Wade wasn't the only one in Ashford Hollow who thought Eli had lost his mind, or at least his financial sense. The county's Dollar House program, technically called the Blighted Property Reutilization Initiative, existed because Ashford Hollow and half a dozen towns like it had more abandoned buildings than the tax base could carry, and a building with no taxable value, and a demolition bill nobody wanted to pay was worse for the county's books than a building given away outright to somebody willing to sign a covenant promising to bring it up to code within 36 months. The chapel had been sitting in that program for going on 3 years, listed and relisted, because everyone who walked through it walked back out shaking their head. The roof had failed over one whole corner of the sanctuary sometime in the last decade, letting in enough water to rot the floor joists beneath and grow a slow black bloom of mold up one wall. The bell tower leaned 2 degrees off true, according to the county's own engineering survey, which had recommended demolition twice and been overruled twice, mostly because nobody could agree on who should pay for that either. The program's rules were simple enough on paper. Applicants submitted a restoration plan and proof of funds for the first phase of work, and the county land bank's 3-member board picked whichever plan looked most likely to actually get finished, since a half-restored ruin was, if anything, worse for the town than a fully abandoned one. Eli's plan was thin on paper, a single typed page and a construction cost estimate he'd worked out himself from years of reading Army engineering specs. But his was the only application that year to come from somebody who stood up in front of the board and said, plainly, that he intended to live in Ashford Hollow the rest of his life regardless of what became of the chapel. The board voted 2-1 in his favor. Hollis's bid, cash-backed and specific down to the square footage of reclaimable stone, lost by that single vote. Hollis Bregman had wanted it for the stone. Hollis ran a salvage yard 2 towns over, Bregman Architectural Reclamation, and he had a good eye and a better truck and a reputation, not entirely undeserved, for stripping a building of everything worth money and leaving the county to deal with the rest. He'd put in for the chapel the same week Eli did, and when the paperwork came back in Eli's favor, he'd made his opinion known at the hardware store, at the diner, and once, memorably, at the gas pump next to Eli's truck. You know what that stone's worth? Cut and cleaned? Hollis said, that day at the pumps, not quite looking at Eli, the way men who want to say something ugly, without owning it will talk to the middle distance, instead of your face. Those windows alone. I had a buyer in Charleston ready to pay real money for salvage rights. You're going to sit up on that hill and pour your own money into holding a roof up over nothing. Building's not worth saving, son. It's worth stripping. It's not for sale, Eli said, and finished pumping his gas, and did not say the other thing he was thinking, which was that a man who saw a 115-year-old chapel and thought first about what it would fetch in pieces was a man Eli didn't much want to explain himself to. Word got around the way it always did in a town small enough to share one 3-aisle grocery. By the time Eli stopped in at the Hollow Diner the following week for coffee before a supply run, the waitress, a woman named Patty who'd been pouring coffee there since before he left for basic training, set his mug down with a look he'd learned to recognize. Everybody's talking about your chapel, she said, not unkindly. Figured they might be. Ed Merchant's taking bets down at the barber shop on how long before the roof finishes falling in on you. She topped off his coffee, though he hadn't asked. For what it's worth, I told him he was a fool and you were worse, and we'd both know for certain who was right come next spring. At the counter, 2 stools down, a retired miner named Furlong, who Eli's father used to drink with, offered his opinion without being asked, the way old men in diners generally did. Your granddaddy'd be spinning in his grave, boy, watching you pour good money into that wreck. Building like that's not meant to be saved. It's meant to be mourned and let go, same as the rest of this town. I don't believe that, Eli said, and Furlong shrugged, unbothered, and went back to his eggs. And that, more or less, was the shape of most conversations Eli had in Ashford Hollow that autumn. Not cruelty, exactly. Nobody in town wished him ill, but a settled, weary conviction, hard-won across 40 years of watching things fail one after another, that some ruins simply stayed ruins, and that a man who believed otherwise was either a fool or hadn't yet been disappointed enough times to know better. He understood where it came from. Ashford Hollow had spent 4 decades watching its mine close, its school close, its young people leave for Charleston or Columbus or anywhere with more than one stoplight, and a person could only watch so much get lost before hope itself started to look like something best rationed carefully, spent only on sure things. Eli wasn't a sure thing, he knew that. He was a one-legged veteran with no construction license and a building the county's own engineers had twice recommended tearing down, and if Ashford Hollow had learned anything in 40 years of decline, it was not to bet on long odds. He understood the doubt, even the parts of it that stung. He wasn't a fool. He knew what the chapel looked like to anyone standing at the bottom of the hill looking up. A ruin, picturesque from a distance and pitiful up close, sinking slowly back into the mountain that had paid for it. He knew what he looked like too, some days, in the bathroom mirror before he strapped the leg on. 34 years old, honorably discharged, more scar tissue than most men collect in a lifetime. No wife, no children, no plan beyond the vague, stubborn conviction that he was not finished yet. Whatever finished was supposed to mean. He went up to see the chapel alone for the first time as its actual owner 3 days after the closing, on a Tuesday, because he wanted the first look to belong to just the two of them, him and the building, before anybody else's opinion got mixed into it. The road up was gravel gone, mostly to washboard ruts, and his truck complained the whole way, but the chapel came into view the way it always had, all at once, around the last bend, gray stone catching the morning light against a sky the color of a healing bruise. Up close, the damage was worse than memory had allowed for. Ivy had worked its fingers into the mortar joints along the north wall. 2 of the tall arched windows on that side had lost their glass to weather and boys with slingshots, boarded over now with plywood gone soft and gray. The oak double doors at the front, though, had held, swollen shut with damp but sound, and when Eli finally got them open with a pry bar in his shoulder, the hinges shrieked loud enough to send a pair of mourning doves clattering out of the bell tower above him. Inside smelled like every abandoned building Eli had ever cleared, overseas and stateside both. Mildew, cold stone, mouse droppings, and underneath it all something older, mineral, like the inside of a cave. Light came down in slanted columns through the gaps in the roof, catching dust that hung motionless in the still air, and for a moment Eli just stood in the doorway and looked at the ruin of it. The 12 rows of pews gone gray and warped, the collapsed section of ceiling over the northeast corner, where sky showed through in a ragged patch, the altar at the far end still standing, stubborn, beneath a stained glass window whose colors had somehow survived a century of neglect, well enough that a shaft of red and gold light lay across the floor, like something spilled. He walked the center aisle slowly, favoring the leg without meaning to, the way he always did on uneven ground, and found the pew, second from the front, left side, where his grandfather used to sit. He sat down in it. The wood groaned under him but held, and he sat there a long while, in a ruined chapel he had just paid $1 to own, and let himself feel, for the first time since he'd signed the papers, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope, but sat somewhere close to both. That was where Ruth Anders found him 20 minutes later, having walked the half-mile up from her house on Colliery Street, with a thermos of coffee and the particular fearlessness of a 78-year-old woman who has decided she has earned the right to go wherever she pleases. "I heard somebody bought this old place," she said, from the doorway, not stepping in yet, as though the chapel itself required an invitation. "Figured it'd be you. Your granddaddy used to walk me home from services here when I was a girl. You know, different lifetime." Eli stood, favoring the leg again, and came back down the aisle to meet her. Ruth Anders had taught 4th grade in Ashford Hollow for 31 years, had buried a husband and outlived a hip replacement, and was, as far as Eli could tell, the last living person in town who remembered the chapel as a working building instead of a ruin. She handed him the thermos without asking if he wanted coffee, which he appreciated because he did. "It's worse inside than I figured," he admitted. "It's worse than you figure until you're standing in the middle of it, and then it's exactly as bad as you were afraid of, and somehow also not as bad as all that." Ruth walked past him up the aisle, unhurried, her eyes moving over the walls the way a person looks at an old photograph of themselves. "I sat right about there," she said, pointing to a pew on the right, "next to my mother, every Sunday from the time I was 4 until the doors closed in '68. Reverend Pruitt used to lose his place in the sermon if a bird got into the rafters, which happened more than you'd think, given how that tower leaked even back then. You remember much about how it was built? Whitfield, I mean, the man himself." Ruth's mouth did something complicated, not quite a smile. "My grandmother knew people who worked for him, said he was hard as the coal he pulled out of this hill, and twice as particular about how things got done. Built this place himself, near enough, oversaw every stone of it after his wife passed. Some folks used to say he put more of himself into this building than he ever put into the mine that made him rich. Which is a strange thing to say about a man, when you think on it." She looked at Eli sideways. "You know the story about the promise?" "What promise?" "Whitfield's promise. It's an old wives' tale, mostly, the kind of thing that gets told at church suppers and loses a little truth every time somebody tells it. Story goes Whitfield meant to build the town a hospital and a proper school once the mine turned enough profit, on account of he lost Anne to a fever that a real doctor might have caught in time, if Ashford Hollow had had one. Story goes he never got the chance, on account of he took sick himself in the flu that came through in '18, same as half this county did, and died before he ever broke ground on either one. Some folks used to say he'd already set the money aside somewhere, before he passed, and that it just never got found. And that's why the mine company never built the hospital he'd promised, even though the coffers, so the story goes, should have had plenty in them." She shrugged, a small, dry motion. "My grandmother's generation used to say it like it was gospel. Mine mostly rolled our eyes at it. Stories older than the buildings had shingles missing, is what I'd say. Every dying coal town's got one story like it. Ours just happens to be about this chapel." Eli looked down the length of the sanctuary toward the altar, where the shaft of colored light still lay across the warped floorboards, and said nothing for a moment, turning the story over the way he'd once turned over a stretch of disturbed roadside, looking less for the shape of the thing itself than for the shape of what didn't belong in it. "You don't believe it," he said, finally. "I believe a lot of things got said about Josiah Whitfield after he died that wouldn't have been said to his face while he was living," Ruth said. "That's most of what legend is, when you get down to it. But I'll tell you this much, Eli Cole. My grandmother swore up and down that Whitfield had this altar built different from the rest of the chapel. Said the stonemasons who worked on it got paid double what the ones on the walls got paid, and got sworn to secrecy besides, and that one of them, an old fellow named Corwin, told her once, deep in his cups, that Whitfield had them build something into that wall behind it that wasn't in anybody's plans but his own." She patted the stone beside her, cool and gray in the colored light. "Might be nothing but a story old men tell to seem more interesting than they were. But you asked, and that's the whole of what I've got." Eli didn't say anything for a while. He was looking at the altar the way he used to look at a stretch of road he didn't like the feel of, not because anything about it was visibly wrong, but because some old, trained-in part of him had gone quiet and alert at the same time, the way it used to go right before he found something buried that somebody had worked very hard to make sure nobody found. "I appreciate the coffee," he said at last, "and the story. Don't go putting too much stock in it," Ruth said, though something in her voice suggested she'd be disappointed if he didn't. "But if you're going to be up here tearing into walls anyhow, I don't suppose it'd hurt to keep your eyes open." Ruth's story stayed with him longer than he expected it to, the way a splinter you can't quite locate stays with you. And on a Wednesday 2 weeks later, with the roof tarped and the worst of the debris cleared, Eli drove the 40 minutes to the county seat and spent an afternoon in the recorder's office instead of on a ladder. The clerk on duty, a young man named Petrie who seemed pleased to have something to do besides field questions about property tax deadlines, pulled the original 1910 and 1911 deed books for him without much fuss, and Eli spent 2 hours at a long oak table under a ceiling fan that didn't move fast enough to matter. Working through Josiah Whitfield's paper trail, the way he used to work a stretch of suspicious ground, methodically, without deciding in advance what he'd find. Most of it was ordinary: land purchases along the ridge, mineral rights filings, a mortgage on the mine equipment taken out and paid off inside of 4 years. Evidence of a man who ran his business with more discipline than most of his contemporaries in the coal counties, several of whom had died broke despite dying rich on paper. But the chapel's own building permit, filed in the spring of 1911, caught Eli's eye for what it didn't say. Every other structure Whitfield had built in Ashford Hollow, the company store, the school, a row of miners' houses along Colliery Street, listed a contracted builder and an itemized materials cost, the way any sensible businessman's paperwork would. The chapel's permit listed no contractor at all, just Whitfield's own name under the line marked Builder of Record, and a materials cost that had been written in, crossed out, and rewritten lower. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow: do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. In a different hand than the rest of the document, Eli sat with that a while, turning it over the way he'd turn over a field report that didn't quite square with what the ground itself was telling him. He found the newspaper archive 2 buildings down, in the Historical Society's single cramped room above the public library, tended by a volunteer who introduced herself as Marjorie and seemed almost giddy at the prospect of a visitor under the age of 70. She helped him thread the microfilm reel for the Ashford Hollow Beacon, a weekly paper that had folded sometime in the 30s, and Eli scrolled through the autumn of 1911 until his eyes ached, past county fair results and mine production tallies and a notice about a revival meeting, until he found, in the 3rd week of October, a single paragraph under the headline "Chapel Dedication Draws Large Crowd." The piece was thin on detail, mostly praise for the building's craftsmanship and a list of dignitaries who'd attended, but one line near the bottom stopped him cold enough that he read it 3 times. Mr. Whitfield, in brief remarks following the dedication, stated that the chapel would in time hold more for this town than its congregation could yet see, and asked the assembled to have patience with him on that score, as he intended, in his words, to finish what he had started here before he was through. Finish what he'd started, Eli said out loud, to nobody, and Marjorie, 3 tables over sorting a box of old land office ledgers, looked up. Find something good? Maybe. You ever hear the name Corwin around here? Stonemason. Would have worked for Whitfield around 1910-11. Marjorie's face did the particular thing older faces do when a name reaches back further than recent memory usually bothers to go. Corwin, she repeated, slow, testing it. There's a Corwin plot out at the old cemetery behind the Methodist church, if that's any help. Families mostly moved on or passed. I couldn't tell you more than the names familiar. It wasn't much, and Eli understood that driving home that evening, the deed photocopies and a folder of newspaper printouts sliding around on the passenger seat every time he took a curve too fast, a materials line crossed out on a permit, a dedication speech vague enough to mean nothing, or everything, a story an old woman's grandmother used to tell about a stonemason who talked too much after a few drinks. It wasn't evidence of anything a courthouse or a bank would ever recognize as such, but it was enough, added to a wall that read 4 inches proud of true on a level that didn't lie, to make Eli Cole drive home with his hands tighter on the wheel than the road actually required. Turning over, again and again, The particular phrase a dying man had chosen to leave behind him in a newspaper nobody had thought to reread in over 100 years. Finish what he had started. He kept his eyes open for the next 6 weeks, though not, at first, on the altar. There was too much else that needed doing before a man could afford to go chasing ghost stories. A roof to tarp before the next rain. A floor to shore up before somebody put a foot through it. An electrical panel so old the county inspector had laughed out loud when he saw it, and then apologized for laughing. Eli called Dom Reyes the same week he signed the papers, and Dom, who had served 2 tours alongside him and now ran a small contracting outfit 2 counties over, showed up that Saturday in a truck loaded with lumber he refused to let Eli pay for, at least not yet. "You're out of your mind," Dom said, standing in the doorway, taking in the collapsed corner of ceiling with the flat, assessing look he used to give a stretch of road he suspected was seeded with something worse than potholes. "You know that, right? You're out of your absolute mind. Heard that a few times already this month. I'm not saying it to talk you out of it." Dom set down his toolbox. "I'm saying it because it's true, and then I'm going to help you anyway, because that's apparently who I am now." He grinned, the same grin Eli remembered from 100 worse places than this. "Where do we start?" They started with the roof, because everything else was going to keep failing until the water stopped getting in. And for 3 weeks that was the whole of it. Tarps and temporary bracing, hauling rotten lumber down the hill in the bed of Eli's truck. Dom teasing him without mercy about his pace on the ladder, and Eli giving it right back about Dom's aim with a hammer. The old rhythm of 2 men who had learned long ago that the fastest way through hard work was to make each other laugh through it. Ruth Anders came up most afternoons with a thermos and, more than once, a casserole dish she pretended was extra from a family dinner nobody in Ashford Hollow believed she'd actually cooked for anyone but them. Callie came on weekends with her boy, who took to sweeping the aisle with an enthusiasm no adult could have paid him for. And even Wade showed up once, awkward and unannounced, and spent 4 hours running conduit without saying much of anything at all. Which was, Eli understood, its own kind of apology. Not every day went easy. There was a Tuesday in the 4th month, hot enough that the tar on the new roof patches had gone soft and tacky underfoot, when Eli's stump swelled inside the socket from too many hours on the ladder, and the leg simply quit taking his weight the way it was supposed to. No warning beyond a wrongness he felt half a second too late. He went down hard off the 3rd rung, caught himself on a stack of lumber more by luck than skill, and sat in the dirt outside the chapel doors for a long moment doing the math on how much worse it could have been, while Dom came around the corner of the building at a dead run, took one look, and made the immediate, deliberate choice not to look alarmed. "You good?" Dom asked, crouching, already reaching for the prosthetics release without being asked, the way he'd once checked a man for shrapnel without waiting to be told where it hurt. "I'm good. Socket swollen. Need it off for a minute." Dom got it off him, set it aside, and sat down in the dirt next to him instead of hovering, which Eli appreciated more than he ever would have said out loud. They sat there together a while, in the shade of the north wall, Eli's bare stump propped on a folded tarp, the 2 of them looking out over the valley, where the old tipple still stood rusting against the tree line. "You remember Kandahar," Dom said, eventually, not really a question. "That checkpoint outside the wire, 2nd tour. 110 in the shade, and there wasn't any shade. I remember. You carried Ochkin 2 miles on that ankle you'd rolled, because the truck was down and command wanted eyes on that ridge before dark, and you never once said a word about the ankle until we got back and the doc had to cut the boot off it." Dom looked over at him. "I'm just saying, this is not the hardest thing I've ever watched you push through. You don't have to prove to me you can do it hurt. I already know you can. Questions whether you should have to. Every single day, on a building that's going to fall down around your ears whether or not you break yourself putting it back up." Eli didn't answer right away. A hawk was working the thermals above the ridge, wide slow circles, not hunting so much as riding the day. "It's not about proving it," he said finally. "I don't know how to explain it so it makes sense to somebody who didn't need it to make sense. Try me. When I was in that hospital, they kept telling me what I'd lost. Number of times, number of different mouths. I got real tired of people telling me what I'd lost, Dom. This is the first thing in 4 years that's felt like something I'm building instead of something I'm recovering from." He looked over. "That's not going to make sense." "Makes plenty of sense," Dom said, and stood, and held a hand down for him. "Come on, give the leg 20 minutes and we'll finish the fascia board before the light goes." They finished the fascia board before the light went. Eli didn't fall off a ladder again for the rest of the project, though not for lack of trying. And Dom never once brought the subject back up, which was, in its way, exactly what Eli needed from him. It was the second week of the 6th month, with the roof finally sound and the floor rebuilt board by board back to the edge of the chancel, that Eli found himself alone in the sanctuary on a Thursday evening, running a level along the base of the wall behind the altar, out of nothing more than an engineer's habit of checking work nobody had asked him to check. The wall was fieldstone, like the rest of the chapel, coursed and mortared with the same care evident in every other surface Whitfield's masons had touched. But the level told him something the eye alone hadn't. That wall sat proud of true, by nearly 4 inches over its width, not from settling, which would have shown a gradual lean, but abruptly, as if the stone behind the altar had simply been built thicker than the walls flanking it, on purpose, from the first course laid. Eli set the level down slowly and stood back, studying the wall the way he used to study a stretch of ground that had gone quiet and wrong beneath his boots, and reached for the hammer he kept clipped to his belt out of the same old habit. He tapped it once, low, near the baseboard. The sound that came back wasn't the flat, solid thock of stone packed tight against earth. It was hollow. Eli sat back on his heels in the colored light spilling down from the window above the altar, and didn't move for a long moment, the hammer loose in his hand, his pulse going harder than a few inches of empty space behind a stone wall had any business making it go. He thought about Ruth's grandmother, and a stonemason named Corwin who'd talked too much after a few drinks. He thought about a materials line crossed out and rewritten lower, in a different hand, on a permit filed in the spring of 1911. He thought about 6 words a dying man had chosen to leave behind him in a newspaper nobody had reread in 100 years. He set the hammer down, careful, the way a man sets down something he already suspects he's going to need steady hands for later, and reached for his phone to call Dom before he'd fully decided to. Dom picked up on the second ring, the particular clipped alertness of a man who has spent enough years answering a phone at strange hours that his voice never quite lost the readiness for bad news. "Talk to me." Wall behind the altar's hollow. Not settling. Built that way. There was a pause on the line, short enough that Eli could picture exactly what was happening on the other end. Dom setting down whatever tool was in his hand, going still the way he used to go still at the first crackle of static that meant something was about to happen. 20 minutes, Dom said, and hung up before Eli could tell him it could wait until morning, which was probably for the best, because it couldn't. Not really. Not for either of them. He sat in the quiet after hanging up and looked at the wall in the lantern light, feeling something he hadn't expected to feel yet. Not excitement exactly, more the particular stillness that used to settle over him in the seconds after a call came in, that something had been found and before anyone confirmed what it was. That stillness had kept him alive more than once. It felt strange, and not unwelcome, to feel it here, in a place built for worship instead of war, over a wall instead of a stretch of open road. He thought briefly of calling Callie, and decided against it, not because he didn't want her to know but because he didn't yet know himself what there was to tell her, and he'd learned a long time ago not to hand somebody he loved a piece of uncertain news at 1 in the morning if it could just as easily wait until he had something solid to hand them instead. There would be time enough for Callie once there was something real to say. For now there was only a hollow wall, a level that didn't lie, and 20 minutes to fill before Dom's headlights came up the gravel. Eli spent those 20 minutes doing the thing his training had drilled into him past the point of choice, which was not touching anything further until he understood what he was looking at. He walked the wall's full width with the level again, marking the transition points in pencil where the stone went from true to proud and back, and found the anomaly ran almost exactly 6 feet across, centered behind the altar, bounded on both sides by masonry that read flush and ordinary. He tapped it in a grid, an inch at a time, the way he'd once tapped for the seam in a stretch of disturbed roadside, and mapped the hollow space by ear before Dom's headlights ever swung up the gravel drive. Whatever was back there, it wasn't a void behind a single loose stone. It ran the height of 3 courses and the width of the chancel, a room's worth of hidden space, or close to it. Dom came through the door still in his work boots, breathing a little hard from taking the front steps 2 at a time, and stopped dead when he saw the pencil grid Eli had marked across the stone. "You mapped it." Wasn't going to start swinging a hammer at a 115-year-old wall without knowing what I was swinging at. Dom ran his own hand along the marked courses. Slow, the old habit of a man checking another man's work, not because he doubted it, but because 4 hands were safer than 2. "This isn't settling," he said, echoing what Eli had already told him on the phone, needing to arrive at it himself before he could quite believe it. Somebody built this on purpose. Whitfield built this on purpose. Whole chapel, if the permit's telling the truth. No contractor of record, just him. They stood there a while in the lantern light, the two of them, looking at 6 feet of stone that had kept a secret for longer than either of their grandfathers had been alive. And Eli felt something settle into him that he hadn't felt with this particular clarity since before the blast. A narrowing of focus down to the one true thing in front of him, uncomplicated by everything else a life could pile on top of a man. He had missed that feeling more than he generally let himself admit. He thought, unbidden, of the day he'd signed the deed at the county annex, Doris asking if he was sure, and the answer he'd given her about being sure the way a man is sure about a marriage he hasn't met yet. He hadn't known, saying it, that there was anything behind that particular certainty, beyond his own stubborn attachment to a building his grandfather used to sit in. He wondered now, looking at 6 feet of deliberately hollow stone, whether some older, quieter part of him had known all along that the pull he felt at the bottom of this hill wasn't only nostalgia. He didn't let himself finish that thought. A man could talk himself into believing anything. Standing in front of a mystery at midnight with a chisel in his hand, and he'd learned a long time ago, downrange, that the moment you started believing what you wanted to be true instead of what the evidence in front of you actually showed, was the moment you got somebody hurt. Dom must have seen something of it on his face, because he clapped a hand once on Eli's shoulder, brief and hard, the same gesture he used to give before a patrol stepped off, half reassurance and half warning both at once. "Whatever's back there," Dom said, "it's been waiting 100 years. It can wait one more careful hour. Let's not be the two idiots who rush a job like this and bury whatever it is under a collapsed wall." Eli nodded and reached for the chisel and made himself breathe the way he'd once taught younger soldiers to breathe before a controlled demolition. Slow and even, 4 counts in and 4 counts out, until the part of his mind that wanted to hurry quieted down enough to let the part that actually knew how to do this kind of work take over instead. "We do this careful," Eli said. "Whatever's back there survived 100 years by staying sealed. I'm not cracking it open with a sledgehammer and finding out the hard way what 100 years of trapped moisture does to whatever's on the other side." "Careful," Dom agreed. "Where do we start?" They started at the bottom course, working a single joint at a time with a chisel and a rubber mallet, clearing century-old mortar in careful inch-long segments and testing each stone for movement before touching the next. It was slow work, the kind of work that 8 hours without seeming to move at all, and twice Eli made them stop entirely when a stone shifted under light pressure in a way he didn't like the feel of, backing off to reassess, rather than push through on momentum alone. Somewhere around midnight, working the 4th course up from the floor, Dom's chisel found a joint that gave differently than the ones around it, not crumbling but sliding. A full 1/4 inch of clean, oiled movement where every other joint in the wall had been packed solid with lime mortar gone hard as the stone itself. They worked in shifts of concentration rather than shifts of time, trading the chisel back and forth whenever one man's hand started to shake from the small, repeated impact of mallet on steel. And somewhere past 11 o'clock they stopped long enough to eat the sandwiches Callie had insisted on packing into Eli's cooler that morning, sitting on overturned crates in the nave with the work light throwing long shadows up into the rafters. "You ever think about what you'll do if there's nothing back there?" Dom asked, around a mouthful of turkey and cheese. "Just an old cistern, or a coal chute somebody bricked in and forgot about." Eli considered the question honestly, the way he tried to consider most things Dom asked him, because Dom had a talent for asking the question underneath the question, without ever quite naming it. "Then I've still got a restored roof, and a floor that won't drop somebody through it," he said. "And I've still got a place in this town that isn't falling down anymore." That was the whole point before Ruth ever mentioned Whitfield's promise. Doesn't stop being the point if the promise turns out to be nothing but an old man's grief talking. That's a healthier answer than I expected. 4 years of therapy will do that to a man. Eli said it dry, half a joke, though it wasn't entirely one, and Dom huffed a short laugh and let it sit there without pushing further, which was one of the things Eli valued most about him, the instinct to know when a door had been opened just wide enough to look through and not 1 inch wider. They finished the sandwiches in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, the particular easy quiet of 2 men who'd spent enough hours together in far worse places that a cold chapel at midnight barely registered as strange. And when they picked the tools back up, the work went faster for the break, the way it usually did, the body finding a rhythm the mind alone couldn't force. Somewhere in the second hour after the meal, working a joint 2 courses higher than the last one they'd cleared, Eli found himself thinking less about gold or fortune, which still felt, if he was honest, like an idea too large and too foreign to actually hold in his hands, and more about Josiah Whitfield himself, a man dead 100 years who had apparently spent the last productive years of his life building something he might never get to explain to anyone. Eli understood that particular kind of building better than he expected to. 4 months into a restoration, nobody in Ashford Hollow had believed would amount to anything, working toward a version of the chapel, and maybe a version of himself, that he couldn't yet fully picture but trusted, in some stubborn, unexamined way, was worth the work regardless of whether anyone else believed in it. He didn't say any of that to Dom. Some thoughts were still better carried alone, at least until they'd finished taking their own shape. The chisel found the next resistant joint a little after midnight, and this time it wasn't the loose panel they'd eventually find 1 course down. It was only ordinary stone, packed as solid as everything around it, and Eli felt the small, familiar drop of a false lead, the same flat disappointment he remembered from a dozen searches downrange that had turned up nothing but dirt and wasted hours. He didn't let it slow him down. He'd learned that lesson a long time before this chapel ever entered his life. You cleared the next foot of ground the same as you cleared the last one, disappointment or not, because the ground didn't care how you felt about it. And neither, as it turned out, did a wall a dying man had built to keep it secret for exactly as long as it took. It was closer to 1 in the morning when Dom's chisel caught on something that wasn't mortar and wasn't stone. He worked it free with careful fingers, a length of wire gone black with age, wrapped twice around a small iron nail driven into a mortar joint at chest height, and hanging from the wire, tarnished nearly black, a thin disc of hammered copper no bigger than a silver dollar. He held it up to the lantern light, rubbing his thumb across the surface until enough of the tarnish came away to show what was scratched into it. 3 letters, cut crude and deep by a hand more used to a chisel than to fine engraving. C period, O period, R period. Corwin, Eli said, and took it from him, turning it over in his palm. He signed his work. Not exactly a signature you'd frame. Man built the most important thing he ever built, and couldn't tell a living soul about it. I'd want to leave my initials somewhere too. Eli pocketed the disc, careful, the way he'd pocket a spent shell casing he meant to keep, and went back to the wall with something that felt, absurdly, like renewed permission, as though Corwin himself, 100 years dead, had just confirmed they were digging in the right place after all. The work went easier after that, not because the mortar gave any more willingly, but because both of them had stopped waiting to be told they were wasting their night and started trusting, in the quiet, stubborn way men learn to trust each other after enough years doing dangerous things side by side, that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Dom hummed, tunelessly, the way he always had on long details, some half-remembered country song neither of them could have named, and Eli found himself almost smiling in the lantern light, an expression that felt unfamiliar enough on his own face that he was glad nobody but Dom was there to see it. By 1:30, they'd cleared an entire course, 6 stones wide, without finding the give they were looking for, and Eli made them stop, sit, drink water, reassess, refusing to let momentum alone carry either of them into carelessness. He walked the wall again with the level, slower this time, checking his own earlier work the way any good engineer double-checks a calculation before trusting it with somebody's safety, and found, a course higher than either of them had thought to look, the faintest variance in the coursing pattern. 1 stone laid a 1/2 inch out of alignment with its neighbors, in a wall where every other stone, for 115 years, had held its line with the precision only a careful man builds to last. Eli came over, ran his fingers along the seam Dom had found, and felt it too, a give that didn't belong in a wall built to last a century. He worked his fingertips into the gap and pulled, gently at first, then with real effort, and a single dressed stone, no larger than a shoebox, slid free of the wall as smooth as a drawer on a track, revealing a dark cavity behind it lined, as far as the lantern light could show, in the tar paper builders had used to keep damp out of a hidden space, 100 years before anyone thought to call it insulation. Eli reached into the cavity first, before Dom could, some old instinct insisting that whatever came next belonged to his own 2 hands, and found the space deeper than the single stone's width had suggested, running back nearly 2 feet into the wall's thickness, walled on 3 sides in dressed stone, as carefully finished as anything visible in the sanctuary above. His fingers found empty air for a long, breath-held moment, and then, further back than he'd expected to need to reach, the unmistakable give of fabric. He drew his hand back slow, careful not to snag whatever it was on the rough edge of the opening, and felt Dom's headlamp swing to follow the motion, both of them holding still in the particular charged silence of men who have learned, the hard way, that the last few inches of any recovery are the ones most likely to go wrong if rushed. Not that far off from actually pulling a wire, Eli thought, an old grim joke he'd made to himself 100 times downrange and never once said out loud to anyone, and it surprised him a little that it surfaced now, in a cold chapel instead of a hot ditch, over a bundle of cloth instead of a length of primer cord. Old training didn't seem to care much what kind of buried thing it was being asked to help him find. It just went to work the way it always had, methodical and unhurried, treating a 100-year-old secret with the same respect he'd once been trained to give something built to kill him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The chapel held the kind of silence that only old stone buildings hold, thick and complete, broken just barely by the tick of the lantern's mantle cooling where Eli had set it down. Dom reached in first, because Eli's hands, for just that one moment, weren't quite steady enough to trust with whatever was in there. And Eli let him, which was its own kind of trust between two men who had spent a decade learning exactly how much weight the other could be counted on to carry. What came out was a bundle wrapped in oiled canvas, tied with waxed cord gone brittle but intact, about the size of a family Bible, and roughly that same shape. Dom set it on the altar itself, the closest flat surface, and stepped back, and Eli understood without either of them saying so that this part belonged to him alone. For a moment neither of them moved toward it. The bundle sat there on the stone altar in the lantern light, patient, undemanding, the way something can sit that has already waited 100 years and isn't in any particular hurry to be understood by two more men after everyone else who might have understood it first had long since died. "We should call Ruth," Dom said, half a question, glancing at his watch. Eli looked at the bundle a moment longer. "We will. Let me just see what it is first. If it's nothing, I don't want to get her hopes up at 1 in the morning over nothing. And if it's not nothing, then she gets here just as fast either way." Eli reached for the cord, and stopped himself, and looked at his own hands for a second the way he sometimes still did, checking without quite meaning to that they were steady enough for whatever came next, an old habit from a life where unsteady hands had once meant something could go badly, permanently wrong. They weren't unsteady now, not really, just charged with more feeling than he generally allowed himself to carry into a piece of careful work, and he made himself set that feeling aside the way he'd once learned to set aside fear itself. Not by pretending it wasn't there, but by simply refusing to let it touch his hands. Dom didn't push him to hurry. He never had, not in 12 years of knowing each other, not through 2 deployments and a hospital ward, and now, apparently, a 100-year-old chapel at 1 in the morning. He just crossed his arms and waited, the same patient stillness he'd shown outside 100 doors, that might or might not have had something dangerous behind them, trusting Eli to open this one the same careful way he'd learned to open all the others. He untied the cord with fingers that had gone steady again, the old training reasserting itself the way it always did once there was actual work to do, instead of just waiting for work to start, and folded back the canvas one careful layer at a time. Inside was a second wrapping, oilskin this time, drier, and inside that a leather-bound journal, the cover cracked but whole, a brass key on a short length of chain resting on top of it, and a single folded sheet of heavier paper tucked beneath the cord that had bound the whole bundle together. Eli unfolded the sheet first. It was a hand-drawn diagram, faded but legible, showing the chancel floor in simple geometric lines, the altar marked, the communion rail marked, and a single small X inked into the floor space just to the left of where the altar's base met the flagstones, with 3 words written beneath it in the same careful, old-fashioned hand that had crossed out and rewritten the materials line on a building permit filed in the spring of 1911. Beneath, not behind. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. 2 words, in a dead man's careful hand, and Eli felt the whole shape of the night rearrange itself around them. The wall they'd spent 4 hours carefully opening no longer the point of the search, but only the first door of what turned out to be several. "Beneath the altar," Dom said slowly, working it out loud the way he used to work out a route on a map. "Not this wall at all. This was never the vault. This was just where he hid the map to it." Man didn't trust one hiding place, any more than he trusted a bank. Eli said, and found, despite everything, that some small, tired part of him wanted to laugh, the way a person sometimes laughs at the exact moment a thing stops being frightening and starts being simply, overwhelmingly real. He looked down at the diagram again, at the small inked X floating just off the altar's base, and felt the old, familiar quiet settle over him one more time. The same narrowing of focus he'd felt the first moment he understood the wall wasn't settling. Whatever waited beneath that flagstone, it had waited 100 years already. It could wait the little while longer it would take him to read, in full, whatever else Josiah Whitfield had thought important enough to write down and seal away alongside it. Eli set the diagram down with the kind of care usually reserved for something still capable of shattering, and picked up the journal instead. The leather had gone stiff with age, the spine cracking faintly when he opened it, and the first page, in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea but remained entirely readable, read, "The private record of Josiah Whitfield, begun this 4th day of March 1911, upon the laying of the chapel's foundation stone. Not for any eye but my own, and, should God will it, for whoever comes after me with the patience to read this far." "Read it out loud," Dom said, quiet, and pulled 2 of the old pew's salvaged cushions over to sit on the chancel steps, and Eli did. The early entries were mostly practical, a builder's log more than a diary. Notes on stone deliveries and masons' wages, and a running argument with the roofer over the pitch of the bell tower that Whitfield had apparently won by the simple expedient of firing the man and hiring another. But threaded through the practical entries, appearing first as a line here and there and then, as the months passed, more openly, was the other thing Whitfield had been building alongside the chapel, in the same careful hand, in the same private book. "I do not trust the banks," an entry from the summer of 1911 read. "And I do not say so where any banker can hear it. For a man in my position cannot be seen to distrust the very institutions his own enterprises depend upon. But I have watched 2 panics in my lifetime take from good men everything they believed secure, in the year 93 and again 4 years past, and I have resolved that whatever this mind gives me, a portion of it will exist somewhere no panic, no run, no failed institution can reach. Gold does not default. Stone does not call a note due. I have begun, through an agent in Pittsburgh I trust as much as I trust any man outside my own household, to convert a portion of each quarter's profit into coin, into bullion, into stones a man can carry in his hand, and know their worth without needing any bank's word for it." Eli read on, and the entries thickened as the years turned, 1912 folding into 1913, and on past the war in Europe that Whitfield wrote of only glancingly. A man more concerned with the affairs of one small hollow in the Alleghenies than with affairs of state, though even that provincial focus had its own dignity to it. A stubbornness, Eli recognized because he'd seen it in his own reflection more mornings than he could count. "The town does not know what I intend, and I am not yet ready that it should." One entry from 1915 read, "I have told no one but Corwin, who built the chamber beneath this altar with his own hands, and swears he will carry the manner of its building to his grave, a promise I intend to hold him to with the wage I pay him for it, which is generous enough that I trust his silence more than I would trust most men's honor. My purpose is this: when the mine has given enough that I need fear no reversal of fortune, I intend to build this town a hospital, that no other man's wife should die of a fever a real doctor might have caught in time, and a proper school beyond the one room the county presently affords it, that the children here might have the same chance at a wider life that my own dear Anne always wished for the daughter we were never given the years to raise. I have not the courage yet to speak this aloud to the town, for a promise spoken and not kept is worse than no promise at all, and I mean to be certain of my ground before I open my mouth." He wrote 100 years ago, and it still sounds like every second guess I've had about telling anybody what I actually want to do with this place, Eli said. And Dom, for once, didn't have a joke ready, just nodded and let him keep reading. A later entry, dated the spring of 1917, was shorter, but no less deliberate. The agent in Pittsburgh writes that gold grows harder to move quietly, as the war in Europe drives its price, and its scrutiny both higher. Banks and governments alike grown nervous of any man converting wealth to metal in large quantity. I have told him to proceed regardless, more slowly if he must, and to take payment in stones where coin draws too much notice, for a handful of sapphires excites no clerk's curiosity the way a wagon of gold bar would. I confess some vanity in the stones themselves, beyond their discretion. Anne was fond of blue, Always, in a dress, in a ribbon, in the sky over this hollow on a clear morning before the tipple's smoke had risen enough to dim it. I tell myself I collect them for their portability and their silence. I suspect, if I am honest in a book no one else will read, that I collect at least a few of them simply because she would have loved them, and there was so little, in the end, that I managed to give her that she loved for very long. Eli stopped reading for a moment, there, and had to clear his throat before he could go on. And Dom, beside him, didn't say a word, just reached over and put a hand briefly on his shoulder the same way he had at the wall hours before, and let him take the time he needed. It struck Eli, sitting on the cold chancel steps at nearly 2 in the morning, that he'd spent 4 years being told, in a dozen different clinical voices, exactly what his injury had cost him, and that here was a man dead a century, who'd found his own private, wordless way of saying the same thing about a wound of his own, a wife lost to a fever he couldn't outrun with all his money, translated instead into sapphires bought for their color instead of their value, a language of grief only Whitfield himself had ever been meant to read. The later entries grew shorter, busier, the mine's fortunes evidently swinging through their own hard years in the early 1920s. That Whitfield recorded in terse, worried lines about production quotas and a labor dispute he seemed to have handled with more fairness than most operators of his era managed, if his own account could be trusted, which Eli found himself inclined to trust more with every page, not because the man asked for sympathy, but precisely because he never once did. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped being about the mine at all. There is sickness in the camp, an entry read, dated the 11th of October 1918, the hand noticeably less steady than in earlier pages. 3 families on Colliery Street have it bad, and Dr. Anselm tells me plainly he has seen nothing like it in his practice. Not the ordinary influenza he treats every winter, but something faster and crueler, taking the young and strong as readily as the old. I have closed the school and the chapel both, against my own wishes, for I had thought to announce my intentions for the hospital this very autumn. The vault beneath this altar grown, at last, to a sum I judge sufficient. It seems a bitter irony that the very sickness I meant that hospital to prevent should arrive before I found the courage to build it. The next entry was dated 4 days later, the hand worse still. I have it myself now. Dr. Anselm does not say so plainly, but I have read enough faces across a negotiating table to read one across a sickbed. I write this in case I do not recover, so that whoever finds this record, be it Corwin, be it some stranger 100 years distant, understands what lies beneath this altar and why. It is not mine. Not truly. Not any longer. It was never meant to sit in the dark forever, only until I was ready, and I have run out of the time I foolishly believed I was owed to grow ready in. Beneath, not behind. Corwin's own mark, cut into the flagstone, will show the place. 3 strikes of the chisel in a triangle. The same mark he cuts into every stone he sets with his own hand, so that a man who knows to look for mason's marks will know he has found the right stone and not merely a stone. The key opens the lock beneath it. What is below is meant for this town, for its sick and its unschooled, for the future I did not live to build myself. I ask only this of whoever reads these words. Do not let it sit forgotten a second time. I made that mistake once, out of fear, and fear does not deserve a second chance at the same theft. The entry after that was the last in the book, 4 lines only, the hand barely legible, more a scrawl than the careful script that had filled every page before it. Anne, I think I will see you sooner than I planned. I hope you will forgive a foolish, frightened, prideful man for taking so long to finish what we started together. Tell our daughter, wherever she waits with you, that her father meant to build her a whole town's worth of chances, and ran out of days before he could. Whoever you are, reading this, finish it for me. There was nothing after that. The remaining pages of the journal were blank, a full third of the book left empty, the way a life gets left unfinished mid-sentence, when nobody involved in living it knew the sentence was about to end. Eli closed the journal slowly and sat with it in his lap for a long moment. And Dom, beside him on the chancel steps, didn't say anything either, and the chapel held its old, thick silence around both of them, while the lantern hissed low and the wind worked at the tarps still covering the last unfinished section of roof. He named her, Dom said, finally, quiet. The daughter. He never even got to name her. Doesn't say if there was a daughter really, or just the one they'd hoped for. Eli looked down at the last page again, at the scrawled, failing hand. Doesn't matter. He meant it the same either way. He thought of Danny. Then, the way he sometimes did at moments that had no obvious business calling Danny to mind. A wife in Fayetteville and a daughter who wasn't yet 2. A man who'd run out of days before he could finish anything either. He thought that maybe this was what Whitfield had understood, dying of a fever 100 years before Eli was born, and what Eli himself had spent 4 years learning the hard way in a hospital bed, in a rehabilitation center, and a string of unemployment lines. That the things a man meant to do and never got to were their own kind of debt, owed not to himself but to whoever came after, and that the only real payment on a debt like that was somebody, eventually, willing to finish it. "We should call Ruth," Eli said. "It's 1 in the morning. She'd never forgive us if we found this without her," and waited for a decent hour to tell her about it. Dom laughed, short and startled, the tension breaking loose from his shoulders for the first time in an hour. "Fair point." Ruth answered on the 4th ring, her voice sharper and more awake than any 78-year-old woman roused at 1 in the morning had any right to sound, and when Eli told her, as plainly as he could manage, what they'd found behind the wall and what the journal said was waiting beneath the floor, there was a long silence on her end of the line before she spoke again. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, she said. "Don't you dare lift that flagstone without me." She made it in 12, in a coat thrown on over what was unmistakably a nightgown, driving her late husband's old sedan up the switchback road, faster than Eli had ever seen her drive anything. And she came through the chapel doors already talking, already asking to see the diagram, the journal, the key, running her thumb over Corwin's careful hand on the page the way a person touches something they've waited a whole lifetime to be allowed to touch. She read the last entry twice, the one to Anne, and when she looked up her eyes were wet, unashamed, the particular grief of a woman who had spent decades keeping a story alive that everyone younger than her had long since dismissed as nothing more than a nice thing old people like to say to each other at church suppers. "I used to think my grandmother made half of it up," she said, filled in gaps with her own hoping, the way people do with any story that gets told enough generations removed from whoever actually lived it. She'd be so pleased to know she had it right, every last piece of it. She wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, brisk, embarrassed at her own tears, and handed the journal back to Eli with the particular care of someone returning something that had briefly, entirely, belonged to her too. "Well, what are we waiting for?" Dom filled her in on the wall, the loose panel, the hours of careful chiseling, and Ruth listened with the fierce attention of a woman determined not to miss a single detail of a night she'd clearly already decided she would be telling and retelling for whatever years she had left. When he mentioned Corwin's copper token, she asked to see it, turned it over in her palm exactly as Eli had, and pressed it briefly to her own chest before handing it back, an unself-conscious little gesture that neither man remarked on, because some things a person did in a moment like that one didn't need remarking on to be understood. "My grandmother would have given her right arm to stand where I'm standing," Ruth said, and her voice, for once, wasn't steady at all. "Show me the mark. Show me where he said to look." They found it within the hour, working the beam of a work light low across the chancel floor at a raking angle until the shadows caught what direct light had washed out for 100 years of foot traffic. 3 small chisel strokes, cut into the corner of a flagstone not 4 feet from where the altar's base met the floor. So faint and so deliberately unremarkable that a man could have walked across it 10,000 times in his life, as generations of Ashford Hollow had, and never once seen it for what it was. Eli knelt beside it, the level and the chisel set aside now, the brass key from the journal's bundle warm in his palm from being carried too long in a closed fist, and worked his fingers into the hairline seam around the stone's edge until he found, near what would have been the northwest corner, a small iron ring recessed into a channel cut, for exactly that purpose, invisible, unless you already knew, the way Corwin had known, precisely where to look. He lifted the ring. Beneath it, set into a shallow iron plate, was a keyhole no larger than his thumbnail, dark with a century of dust, and Eli fitted the brass key into it with hands that had gone entirely, perfectly steady, the way they always did, in the end, once the moment actually arrived. The lock turned with a resistance that gave way all at once, a full quarter turn of old iron grinding against itself for the first time in 108 years, and the flagstone, when Eli and Dom together worked their fingers beneath its edge and lifted, came up on a hinge nobody could have guessed was there, revealing not the shallow cavity Eli had half expected, but a narrow stone stairway, cut straight down into the hillside the chapel's foundation had been laid against. descending into a darkness that swallowed the worklight's beam after the fourth step, and gave nothing back. Cool air rose out of the opening. Dry, mineral, undisturbed, the particular breath of a space that had not exchanged its atmosphere with the world above it, in longer than any of the three people standing over it had been alive. Whitfield didn't build a hiding place, Dom said, very quietly, staring down into it. He built a vault, an actual vault, into the mountain itself. Ruth crossed herself, an old habit Eli had never once seen her perform in all the months he'd known her, and didn't say anything at all. Eli picked up the worklight, tested his weight on the first stone step, and found it solid, cut clean and mortared tight, built by a man who'd meant it to outlast him by a very long time. He looked back once at Dom, and at Ruth standing behind him with both hands pressed to her mouth, and started down. The stairway ran 8 steps, tight enough that his shoulders nearly brushed both walls. The stone underfoot worn only faintly, the marks of a handful of visits a century ago, and nothing since. And at the bottom it opened into a chamber perhaps 12 feet square, low-ceilinged, dry as a bone. The walls lined in the same careful fieldstone as the chapel above, laid by a man who had apparently decided that even a secret deserved to be built well. Eli paused at the bottom for a moment, before letting the beam sweep further, some old instinct insisting he take in the whole of a space before focusing on any one part of it, a habit that had served him well downrange, and served him just as well now, standing at the threshold of a room built to hold a dead man's entire unfinished intention. The air tasted faintly of stone and something else beneath it, cedar perhaps, or the ghost of whatever oil Corwin had used to seal the crates 100 years before, and the silence down here was even thicker than the silence above, a silence with no wind in it at all. Nothing but his own breath and the small tick of the worklight's beam finding the room a degree at a time. The worklight's beams swept the room and found, first, wooden crates, 6 of them, stacked 2 and 3 high along the near wall, their timber gone gray and brittle at the edges but whole, undisturbed, marked in stenciled black paint too faded now to fully read except for a single legible word repeated on every crate: Whitfield. Eli set the light down on the floor, angled up, and pried the lid from the nearest crate with the flat of the chisel he still had clipped to his belt, and the old nails gave with a shriek of protest a century overdue, and the lid came away, and the beam of the worklight fell directly across what was packed inside, and for a long moment Eli Cole, 34 years old, one leg, 12 years a soldier, a man who had spent the last 4 of those years being told everywhere he went what he had lost, simply knelt there on the floor of a mountain no one had opened in 100 years, and looked at what a dying man had left behind for exactly this moment, unable, for the length of several full breaths, to make himself understand that it was real. Gold bars filled the crate in stacked, gleaming rows, each one dulled with a fine gray patina of century-old dust that did nothing at all to dim the color underneath. Once Eli's thumb wiped a clean streak across the nearest one, and the metal came up bright and heavy, and unmistakably, impossibly itself. Beside the crate sat a smaller iron-strapped chest, its lid unlatched with a second small key hanging from its hasp, and when Eli lifted that lid the beam of the worklight caught 1,000 small discs of gold coins stacked in paper-wrapped rolls. Double eagles by the look of the eagle stamped into the nearest one, more of them than Eli could begin to count by eye. A third container, a leather satchel gone stiff with age, held, when he worked its buckle loose, a scattering of loose stones that even untrained eyes could tell were not glass, deep blue and clear white, and one, larger than the rest, a green so saturated it seemed to hold its own light even in the flat wash of the work lamp. A flat oilskin packet, tucked beside the satchel, proved to be a sheaf of certificates, railroad and mining ventures whose names Eli didn't recognize. Their paper gone brittle and yellow, but their engraved seals still crisp, still legible, still, for all Eli could tell in that first stunned moment, possibly still worth something to somebody, somewhere, 100 years on. Eli sat back on his heels in the crowded, dust-thick air of the chamber and made himself do the thing his training had always insisted on before anything else, which was breathe, slow, and look again. Because a mind under shock had a bad habit of seeing only the loudest thing in a room and missing everything quieter around it. He made himself catalog it properly, the way he would have cataloged any other find, out loud, under his breath, more to steady his own hands than because anyone was there to hear him. 6 crates, gold bar in the first, stacked in rows he still hadn't fully counted. A coin chest beside it, heavier than it looked when he tested its weight. More double eagles wrapped in their paper rolls than he could begin to estimate without sitting down and actually counting them one by one, which he had no intention of doing at 2 in the morning by the light of a single work lamp. A satchel of loose stone, blue and white, and one deep, saturated green he already suspected, without knowing the first thing about gemology, was worth more than every other stone in the satchel combined. A packet of certificates whose value he couldn't begin to guess. Engraved seals for companies that might be worth nothing at all now, or might, for all he knew, sitting in a hole in a mountain in West Virginia, still hold claims on land or mineral rights that 100 years hadn't managed to erase. He didn't let himself put a number to any of it. Numbers felt dangerous, right then, the kind of thing that could turn a moment like this into something smaller than it actually was. A story about dollars, instead of a story about a man who'd spent the last years of his life trying, however imperfectly, to keep a promise he'd made to a wife he couldn't save, and a town he'd come to feel responsible for. Eli had learned, the hard way, in a hospital bed with a doctor reciting percentages of function retained, that a number could tell you almost nothing true about the actual weight of a thing. He thought, unexpectedly, of Wade at the dinner table 4 months back, asking whether Eli was sure about sinking his settlement into a building nobody else would touch, and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite triumph, and wasn't quite vindication either. Something quieter and less satisfying than either of those words implied. Closer to the particular ache of being proven right about a thing he'd never actually been trying to prove. And in the very last crate, smaller than the others, tucked beside a second, thinner journal Eli didn't yet have the composure to open, was a single small velvet box. Its fabric rotted through in patches, but its hinge still sound, and inside it, resting on cracked silk, a woman's ring, a plain gold band set with one modest, honest diamond, the kind of ring a young man buys before he's rich, before a mine makes him wealthy enough to buy anything grander, the kind of ring a man keeps not because it's worth much, but because it's worth everything. Eli held that box a long time, longer than he held anything else in the chamber, and above him, at the top of the stone stairs, he heard Ruth's voice, hushed and disbelieving, calling down into the dark. "Eli, Eli, what is it? What did you find?" He looked up the narrow stairway at the faint wash of light where she stood, and found, when he tried to answer her, that he didn't have a single word ready that felt large enough for what he was kneeling in the middle of, a mountain's worth of a dead man's unfinished promise. A century late and, somehow, exactly on time. "Come down," he finally said. "Both of you, come see what he kept." Ruth came down the stairway first, one hand braced on the stone wall, Dom right behind her with a second work light, and when the beam of it swung across the open crates, she stopped so completely that Dom nearly walked into the back of her. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She crossed to the nearest crate and knelt beside it, slow, her knees clearly protesting the stone floor, and reached out one hand to hover just above the gold without quite touching it, the way a person hovers a hand above a flame to feel the heat without risking the burn. "My grandmother used to say, Corwin told it true," she said, finally, her voice gone thick. "I spent 60 years thinking she'd let an old man's tall tale get the better of her good sense." She looked up at Eli, and there were tears on her face now that she didn't bother wiping away. She'd have given anything to see this, anything at all. Dom, for his part, hadn't said a word since they'd come down the stairs. He stood near the crates with his arms crossed, jaw tight, and when Eli glanced at him, he saw something on his old friend's face that surprised him. Not the easy grin Dom wore through most of life's difficulties, but something rawer, harder to place. "You good?" Eli asked. Dom nodded, slow, and finally spoke. "Just thinking about every guy we knew who didn't make it home to see something like this. Feels wrong, almost, standing here with all this, when so many of them didn't get anything at all." Eli understood that better than he could easily say. "Doesn't feel wrong to me," he said, after a moment. "Feels like a reason to make sure it goes somewhere that would have mattered to them too." Dom held his eyes a moment, then nodded once, the old understanding passing between them the way it always had, without needing many words to carry it. "She's the reason we found it," Eli said. "You told me the story. I wouldn't have gone looking without it. I told you a legend, Eli Cole. You're the one who put a level to a wall at midnight because a legend bothered you enough not to let it go." Ruth pushed herself back to her feet, refusing the hand Dom offered. and looked around the small chamber with the particular fierce attention of a woman cataloging every detail for a story she intended to tell exactly right for the rest of her life. What happens now? It was a fair question, and Eli realized, standing in a stone chamber 100 feet from where he'd signed a $1 deed 4 months earlier, that he didn't have an answer yet. He looked at the ring box still in his palm, at Dom's face in the worklight, at Ruth watching him with the same patient expectation she must have once turned on 30 years of fourth graders waiting to see what he'd do next. "Now we don't touch anything else tonight," he said, the old training reasserting itself the way it always did, once the first shock wore thin enough to let judgment back in. "We don't move it. We don't count it. We don't tell anybody else until I've talked to somebody who actually knows the law around a find like this. Because I have no idea what happens to a 100-year-old fortune somebody else buried on land I now own. And I'd rather find out the right way than the hard way." "Sensible," Dom said. "We lock the chapel. All of us go home. I make some calls in the morning." Eli looked at the crates one more time, at the gold and the coin, and the stones and the certificates, and the small velvet box he still hadn't let go of, and felt, underneath the disbelief that hadn't finished working its way through him, something steadier starting to take hold. The particular calm that had always come to him, eventually, once a chaotic situation resolved into a series of concrete next steps. Whitfield waited 100 years to be found. He can wait one more night to be dealt with properly. They resealed the flagstone before they left, though none of them said out loud what they were all thinking, which was that the lock and the 100 years of undisturbed silence above it had done a better job of guarding this fortune than any door they could improvise at 1 in the morning ever would. Eli drove home with the journal on the passenger seat, the ring box in his jacket pocket, and didn't sleep at all before the sun came up, running through everything he'd need to do and everyone he'd need to call, the same methodical planning he used to do before any operation that mattered. He called Marion Keel first thing, a property and estate attorney with an office above the pharmacy in the county seat, who'd handled the paperwork on his mother's small estate years before, and had struck Eli, in that brief dealing, as somebody who told a client the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. She listened to the whole account without interrupting, and when Eli finished, she was quiet long enough that he checked to see if the call had dropped. "I'm going to need to see the deed, the journal, and the property itself," she said, finally. "But I'll tell you what I already know, sitting here without having seen any of it. You hold clear title to that chapel, transferred to you by the county with no reservations, no liens, no competing claims of record. Whatever Josiah Whitfield concealed on that property before his death in 1918, and never disclosed to anyone in a position to make a competing claim, generally becomes the property of whoever holds clear title to the real estate today, under what the law calls the doctrine of fixtures and buried property, provided nobody else comes forward with a superior, documented right to it. His estate, if it was ever formally probated, would have closed out a century ago. There may be a distant heir somewhere with an emotional claim. There is almost certainly no one with a legal one, this many decades on, but I'll research that properly before either of us gets ahead of ourselves. So it's mine. Very likely, yes. But I want to say this plainly, because I've seen it go wrong for people who didn't hear it plainly enough in time. You are about to become the center of a great deal of attention, and some of that attention is going to come from people whose interest in your good fortune has nothing to do with your good fortune and everything to do with their own. Move slowly. Verify everything. Don't sign anything you haven't had me read first, no matter how friendly the person handing it to you seems." She paused. "And congratulations, Eli. Truly, I mean that. What do I actually do next? Practically, I mean. I've got a stone room in a mountain full of gold, and no idea what the first real step even looks like. First step is silence. Nobody outside this call knows what you found yet, and that stays true until I say otherwise. Second step is security, which I'll arrange myself, discreetly, starting tomorrow morning. Third step is authentication, because before anyone can tell you what any of this is worth, we need experts who can tell us conclusively what it actually is. And fourth, once we have real numbers, we talk taxes, because the federal government is going to want a considerable share of whatever this turns out to be, and planning for that properly from day one will save you a great deal of grief 2 years from now." Marion's voice had the particular calm of someone who had clearly had some version of this conversation before, if never quite at this scale. "None of that happens overnight. I'd ask you to be patient, Except I have a feeling patience isn't going to be your problem. No, Eli admitted. Not knowing is going to be my problem. Then, let's go find out properly, instead of guessing badly and getting it wrong. He could hear her already flipping through a calendar. I'll have someone at the chapel by tomorrow evening. Don't go back down there alone before then. The weeks that followed didn't feel like the sudden, cinematic transformation Eli had half expected. Watching enough television in his life to have some idea of what finding a fortune was supposed to look like. It felt, instead, like an unusually intense construction project, which was perhaps the only kind of chaos Eli had ever actually been built to manage well. Marian arranged for a bonded security service to secure the chapel around the clock, discreetly, before word could spread. She brought in a forensic historian from the state university, a careful, sharp-eyed woman named Professor Naomi Wren, who specialized in Appalachian industrial history and who spent 3 full days in the county recorder's office and the Historical Society's cramped archive room before she ever set foot in the chapel itself. Cross-referencing Whitfield's journal against deed records, newspaper archives, and a set of mine production ledgers held in a university special collection 200 miles away that nobody in Ashford Hollow had known existed. It's genuine, she told Eli, at the end of that 3rd day, spreading photocopies across the folding table Dom had set up in the nave. Every date in that journal cross-checks against an independent record. The materials line on the building permit, the labor dispute in the 20s, even the specific wording of the newspaper account of the dedication. A forger with access to all of this could have built a convincing fake, theoretically, but nobody's ever suspected there was anything here worth faking, which is exactly the kind of thing that makes fakes rare and genuine finds like this one so remarkable when they actually turn up. In 30 years of doing this work, I've seen perhaps 2 comparable finds, and neither had documentation half this complete. She spent a 4th day in the chapel itself, running her own hands over the wall Eli and Dom had opened, photographing the loose panel from every angle, and it was late in that afternoon, kneeling by the altar with a small flashlight, that she found something neither of them had noticed in all the hours they'd spent in that exact spot. A second mason's mark, fainter than the first, cut into the underside of the altar's stone base, where a man would only find it lying flat on the floor and looking straight up, 3 strikes in a triangle, just like the one on the flagstone, but beside it, smaller, a single letter that took Professor Wren a full minute of careful cleaning to be certain of. A, she said, sitting back on her heels. Corwin cut an A into the stone, right here, where only somebody who already knew to look would ever find it. For Anne, Eli said, and felt something in his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected a scratch of century-old stone to manage. For Anne, Professor Wren agreed. Whitfield built her a memorial, and the man who helped him keep the secret made sure her name was carved into the foundation of it, where nobody, but the 2 of them, and now us, would ever know to look. That's not the kind of detail anyone fabricates for a hoax, Mr. Cole. That's the kind of detail that only exists because it was true. Franklin Osei, a numismatist Marian brought down from Pittsburgh, spent 4 hours alone with the coin chest and came out of the chapel looking, in Eli's estimation, faintly dazed. Most double eagles from this era, you find them worn, circulated, melted down over the decades whenever gold prices spiked, he said. These have never circulated, sealed in their original paper rolls for over a century, in stable conditions. Some of these dates and mint marks are genuinely scarce even in worn condition. In this condition, uncirculated, uncleaned, uncatalogued, we're not talking about melt value anymore. We're talking about a serious premium, coin by coin, and there are enough of them here that the premium alone runs into 8 figures. The gemstones took longer, sent under armed transport to a laboratory in Charleston for full appraisal, and came back with a report that made even Marian, who Eli had come to think of as essentially unshakable, raise her eyebrows. The sapphires were fine but unremarkable, a solid, respectable value in aggregate. The single large green stone, though, turned out not to be an emerald at all, but something rarer, a Colombian trapiche emerald of a size and clarity the lab's own gemologist described, in careful, measured language, as museum grade, the kind of stone that came up for sale perhaps once in a decade, and drew serious bidders from 3 continents when it did. It was the certificates, though, that produced the strangest turn of all. Most of the railroad and mining paper turned out to be exactly what Eli had expected. Historical curiosities from companies that had gone bankrupt or been absorbed and dissolved generations before, worth something to a collector of financial ephemera, but nothing close to their printed face value. One certificate, though, a modest-looking share in something called the Blackwater Mineral and Timber Company, caught the attention of a researcher Marion hired specifically to run down the paper trail, a careful younger attorney named Priya Castellano, who spent 2 full weeks buried in county mineral records before she called Eli directly, her voice tight with the particular excitement of somebody who has just found something nobody else thought to look for. That company dissolved on paper in 1931, she told him, but it never formally released its mineral rights on about 1,100 acres 2 ridgelines over from where you're standing. And under West Virginia law, mineral rights can be severed from surface rights and survive independently for a very long time if nobody affirmatively abandons them. A natural gas company has been quietly trying to clear title on that exact parcel for the better part of 3 years, because there's a productive shale formation under it they'd very much like to develop, and they have had no idea, this whole time, that a single certificate sitting in a hole in a mountain represented the last unresolved claim standing in their way. She let that sit a moment. "Mr. Cole, that certificate alone is going to be worth considerably more than everything else in that chamber combined, once the negotiation plays out." It took another 6 weeks of careful, methodical work, Marion negotiating with the gas company, from a position Priya's research had made unexpectedly strong, Professor Wren finishing her formal historical assessment, Franklin Osei completing a coin-by-coin catalog, before anyone was willing to put a single number on the whole of what Josiah Whitfield had left behind. Marion called Eli into her office for that conversation, rather than delivering it over the phone, and Eli brought Callie with him, because by then there was no version of this story he wanted to hear for the first time without his sister sitting beside him. "Gold bullion, at melt value, appraises just under 70 million, Marion said, working down a typed summary sheet. The coin collection, factoring in Franklin's numismatic premium, closer to 95 million. The gemstones, driven almost entirely by that one Trapiche emerald, 54 million. The Blackwater mineral rights, after negotiation with the gas company concluded this past Tuesday, 251 million. She looked up. That's a total, across every category, of approximately $475 million. Callie made a small sound beside him, somewhere between a laugh and something closer to a sob, and gripped Eli's hand hard enough to hurt, and Eli sat very still, the way he'd learned to sit still through every piece of news that changed the shape of his life without warning, good or bad, and let the number wash over him without quite managing to make it feel real. "Say it again," he said, finally. $475 million, Marion said, patient, understanding exactly why he'd asked. He thought of Doris stamping his deed at the county annex, telling him the roof had been open to sky since the bicentennial. He thought of Wade's face across a pot roast, asking if he was sure. He thought of Hollis at the gas pump, and Furlong at the diner counter, and the particular, settled weariness of a town that had spent 40 years learning not to bet on anything. None of them, including Eli himself standing at the bottom of that hill 4 months earlier, could have imagined a number like the one Marion had just said out loud. Twice now, in the calm, measured voice of a woman who dealt in exactly this kind of unbelievable fact for a living. "It doesn't feel like mine," he admitted. "It is yours, legally and otherwise," Marion said. "What it feels like is a separate question, and from what I've seen of you these past months, I suspect you already know the answer to that one better than I do. That's not counting the journal itself, which the Historical Society and 2 different university archives are already asking to acquire, or the Corwin token, or your ring," Marion added, gentler now. "Some things don't get appraised the same way. I'd have told you that even before I had a number for the rest of it." The physical move happened on a gray Tuesday in February, under armored transport Marion had arranged weeks in advance. The gold and coin and stone crated up properly this time in foam-lined cases instead of century-old wood, and driven under guard to a secure depository in Charleston, while Eli watched from the chapel steps with a feeling he couldn't quite name, something between relief and an odd, unexpected grief at seeing the vault emptied out after months of it sitting exactly as Whitfield had left it. Dom stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the last case loaded. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Dom said. "Watching it leave." "Little bit." Eli looked back at the chapel, at the flagstone they'd leave permanently sealed once the last of the historical documentation was finished, At the wall they'd have to rebuild properly now that its secret no longer needed keeping. Wasn't really about what was down there, though. Not for me. Was about what was true about the wall, and being the kind of person who noticed it instead of walking past. You always were too stubborn to walk past something that didn't add up. Trained that way. Dom clapped him once on the shoulder, the same gesture from the night they'd found the hollow panel, and they stood together a while longer, watching the truck pull away down the switchback road, carrying a fortune neither of them had ever expected to see toward a future neither of them could have predicted 4 months earlier, back when the whole of it had still been nothing more than a level reading 4 inches proud of true, and a hunch Eli hadn't been able to shake. Word got out 3 days later, not through any announcement Eli made, but through a title search. A Charleston reporter's cousin happened to notice while doing unrelated research on the gas company's land dealings. And by the following Monday, there were 2 television vans parked at the bottom of the switchback road, and a headline running on 3 different news sites that Eli didn't read past the first line of, mostly because Ruth read it out loud to him over the phone in a tone of pure, delighted outrage. Disabled veteran buys condemned chapel for $1. Discovers $500 million fortune. They rounded up, Ruth said. 475 isn't $500 million. I called and told them so myself. A reporter from one of the Charleston stations asked, eventually, for an actual interview, and Marion, after some deliberation, advised Eli to give exactly one, on the theory that a single clear statement would do more to settle the story than a dozen refusals ever could. Eli agreed to it on one condition, which was that they film it at the chapel itself rather than in some studio, because he wanted whatever he said to have the building standing behind him while he said it. The reporter, a young woman named Alicia Farrow who'd clearly done her homework, asked him first about the discovery itself, the wall, the level, the hollow sound, and Eli answered plainly, without embellishment, the same way he might have briefed a report to a commanding officer. Then she asked the question he'd known was coming since Marion first mentioned the interview. What does a man do with $475 million he never expected to have? Eli considered the question a moment, looking past the camera at the restored bell tower rising behind him against a gray autumn sky. He finds out it was never really his to begin with, he said. Man built this place 100 years ago because he lost somebody he loved and didn't have a doctor good enough to save her. He meant every dollar of what he hid behind that altar for this town, not for himself. I just happened to be the one who found it in time to finish what he started. He paused. I spent 4 years after I got hurt overseas being told, by a lot of well-meaning people, everything I'd lost. This is the first thing that's felt like it was ever about what I could give, instead of what got taken. I'd rather talk about that than the number, if it's all the same to you. The clip ran on the local news that evening, and, within a week, on a handful of national programs besides, and Eli found himself, to his own mild bewilderment, described in more than one headline as gracious, a word he'd never once applied to himself and wasn't sure he entirely deserved, though Callie told him, watching the segment together on her living room couch with Jonah asleep between them, that it was exactly the right word, and that she'd known it was the right word about her brother long before any reporter from Charleston ever thought to use it. Ashford Hollow, a town that had spent 40 years watching its population shrink one U-Haul at a time, found itself, for a few strange weeks, on the receiving end of more outside attention than it had gotten since the mine's original boom. Patty at the diner started keeping a scrapbook. Ed Merchant apparently paid out on every bet he'd ever taken about the roof collapsing, with what Furlong reported was reasonably good grace for a man who'd lost that particular wager as badly as anyone in town history. Furlong himself, cornered by Eli at the gas pumps a week after the story broke, had the decency to look almost sheepish. "Guess your granddaddy's not spinning after all," he said. "Guess not. Man like you, coming home the way you did, taking on a building nobody else would touch. I said things I shouldn't have said, back when it looked like a fool's errand." Furlong shifted his weight, uncomfortable in the particular way old men get uncomfortable admitting they were wrong about something. "I'm not too proud to say I was glad to be wrong about it. Wasn't looking for an apology, Furlong. Getting one anyway." Patty had a different kind of reaction entirely. The following week, when Eli came in for his usual coffee before a supply run and found the whole diner unusually quiet, every head turning as he came through the door, in a way that made him wish, briefly, for the old anonymity he hadn't fully appreciated until it was gone. Patty set his mug down without a word, topped it off, and then, instead of moving on to the next table, stood there a moment, twisting her order pad in her hands. "I've poured coffee in this town for 31 years, she said. "Watched near everybody I grew up with pack a U-Haul and leave for someplace with better prospects. Started to believe there wasn't a single good thing left that was ever going to happen here again." She set the pad down. "You proved me wrong, and I have never in my life been happier to be wrong about something. That's all. Just wanted you to hear it plain, not shout it across a room with everybody listening." "I appreciate that, Patty. Coffee's on the house. Has been since the story broke, and will be for as long as you keep coming in here, and don't you dare argue with me about it." She gave him a look that closed the subject entirely, the same look she'd probably been closing subjects with for 31 years, and went back to work. And Eli drank his coffee in a diner gone back to its normal quiet hum of conversation. Grateful, more than he could easily have explained, for a town that had decided to let him simply be Eli Cole again rather than a headline. Wade's reckoning came at a family dinner, the same table where he'd first told Eli, 4 months earlier, that he was throwing his settlement away on a wreck no contractor in the county would touch. Callie had insisted on the dinner, not to make a point, but because it was Sunday and that was simply what they did, and Wade sat through most of the meal quieter than Eli had ever known him to be, pushing food around his plate with the particular discomfort of a man working up to something he didn't have practiced words for. "I was wrong," he said, finally, into a lull in the conversation, not looking up from his plate. "About the chapel, about all of it. I want you to know I know that. I know you do. It wasn't really about the building." Wade set his fork down. "I've spent my whole life playing it safe, Eli. Steady job, steady house, steady everything. And some part of me looked at you buying a condemned chapel for $1 and thought you'd lost your mind. Because the alternative was admitting that maybe I was the one who'd never once in my life bet on anything. And here you were, betting on the biggest long shot in the county, on one leg. And some ugly little part of me wanted you to be wrong so I wouldn't have to think too hard about what that said about me." The table had gone quiet. Jonah looking between the grown-ups with the careful attention of a 7-year-old who understood something important was happening, even if he couldn't have named it. And Eli felt something in his chest loosen that he hadn't fully realized was still tight. "You don't have to say all that, Wade." "I know I don't. I'm saying it anyway." Wade finally looked up. "You did something with a whole lot less than what you started with, than most men would have managed with a whole lot more. I'm proud to be your brother, even if it took me 4 months and a $500 million headline to say it out loud." $475 million, Eli said, and for the first time all evening, allowed himself to grin. Ruth would want that corrected on the record. Hollis Bregman took longer to come around, and came around sideways, the way certain proud men always did. Eli ran into him at the hardware store in early spring, both of them reaching for the same shelf of masonry sealant, and Hollis, to his credit, didn't pretend the last 4 months hadn't happened. "Heard the number," Hollis said, not quite meeting Eli's eyes. "Heard it a dozen times, actually. Man can't go anywhere in this county without hearing it. Yeah, I called you a fool at the gas pumps. Told you that chapel wasn't worth saving, only worth stripping." Hollis turned the can of sealant over in his hands, not really reading the label. "I've thought about that conversation more than I'd like to admit. You weren't wrong that the building looked like a wreck, Hollis. You just had it backward about what a wreck's actually worth saving for." Eli considered him a moment, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't have any particular appetite for making the man squirm longer than he already was. "I could use somebody who actually knows reclaimed stone and old glasswork for the restoration work still ahead of me. Real contract, real pay, not a favor. You interested, or is your pride going to get in the way of good business?" Hollis looked at him a long moment, something working behind his eyes that Eli recognized. A proud man deciding whether he could accept a hand up from somebody he'd underestimated without it costing him something he wasn't willing to pay. "I'm interested," he said, finally. "And for what it's worth, Cole, I'm glad the board voted the way it did. Wouldn't have admitted that 4 months ago. Admitting it now." The one complication Marion had warned him about arrived by certified letter in late April, from a woman in Pittsburgh named Diane Whitfield Cross, identifying herself as the great-great-niece of Josiah Whitfield through his younger brother's line, the only branch of the family that had continued past Josiah and Anne's own childless marriage. Marion had already found the connection weeks earlier during her research, and warned Eli it was only a matter of time before somebody else found it too. The letter was polite, almost apologetic in tone, making no legal claim, only asking, hesitantly, whether the family might be permitted to see the journal and visit the chapel, since nothing of Josiah Whitfield's had survived in family memory, beyond a single formal photograph, and the vague, half-forgotten story of a wealthy relative who died young and left no children. Eli called her himself rather than letting Marian handle it, because some things, he decided, a man ought to do in his own voice. "You're not the first person Marian warned me might come forward," he told her, "and I want you to know right away. This isn't a legal conversation as far as I'm concerned. You're welcome here. Whitfield's your family. That means something, whatever a lawyer would say about it." Diane cried on the phone, unashamed, the way Ruth had cried in the vault, and came to Ashford Hollow 3 weeks later with her elderly father, a soft-spoken retired schoolteacher who stood in the restored sanctuary for a long time without saying anything at all, looking up at the stained glass the way a man looks at something he has been told about his whole life without ever quite believing it was real. "My grandfather used to say there was money in the family once," Diane's father said, quiet, mostly to himself. "Nobody ever believed him, not even me, and he was my own father." He looked at Eli. "You didn't have to call us. Marian told us herself you'd been advised there was almost certainly no legal claim to worry about. You could have let the letter go unanswered, and nobody would have faulted you for it." "Didn't feel like a decision, honestly," Eli said. Man spent his whole journal talking about family, about what he owed the people who came after him. Seemed wrong to read all that, and then turn around and shut his actual family out because a lawyer told me I was allowed to. Diane's father's eyes went bright, and he had to look away for a moment, out toward the restored stained glass, before he could speak again. Josiah Whitfield built a memorial to a wife he lost too young, in a town he built with his own hands. And history forgot him so completely that even his own family stopped believing he'd been anyone worth remembering. He looked back at Eli. "You didn't just find his fortune, son. You gave him back." Eli gave them the second, thinner journal to keep, the one still unread from the final crate, once Professor Wren had finished photographing every page for the historical record, because some inheritances, he'd come to understand, belonged to blood rather than to deed, whatever the law said about buried property and clear title. He kept Anne's ring, and Corwin's copper token, in a small case he had built into the base of the restored altar itself, visible behind glass, with a short brass plaque that named both of them plainly, Anne Whitfield and the mason who kept her husband's secret, so that anyone who ever stood where Eli had once knelt in the lantern light would understand that the fortune behind that wall had never really been about the fortune at all. What Eli did with the money, in the end, took most of a year to fully set in motion, and he did none of it alone. He established the Whitfield Ferris Foundation, a name Callie had suggested one evening, without quite realizing what she was suggesting, and Eli hadn't been able to say anything at all for a long moment after she said it, because it was exactly right, and he'd needed someone else to hand him the words before he could admit how badly he wanted them. The foundation funded two things above everything else. The first was a small community health clinic on the site of the old company store, staffed with a rotating roster of doctors from the university medical system, free at the point of care for anyone in the county who needed it. Built, at Eli's insistence, with an emergency stabilization unit good enough that nobody in Ashford Hollow would ever again have to watch a fever turn fatal for lack of a doctor close enough to catch it in time. The second was a scholarship and vocational trust for Ashford Hollow's children, covering trade school and college both, with a standing preference, written into the foundation's charter in language Marian drafted with unusual care, for children who had spent time in foster care, the way Ruth's own memory of a one-room schoolhouse had reminded Eli that Whitfield's original promise had been about more than medicine. Callie had suggested the name on the back porch one evening in early winter, the two of them going over a list of possibilities Marian had drawn up, none of which had felt right to either of them. "What about something with Danny's name in it too?" Callie said, almost offhand, testing the idea out loud before she'd fully committed to it. "Whitfield never got to build his hospital. Danny never got to come home. Feels like they're both the same kind of unfinished, in their own way." She looked over at her brother. "Whitfield Ferris Foundation. What do you think?" Eli hadn't been able to answer her right away. He'd sat with it a long moment, turning it over, and when he finally trusted his voice enough to speak, all he'd managed was, "Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it." And Callie had reached over and squeezed his hand the way she had in the driveway, 4 months before all of this started. The old signal between them that had never once needed more words than that to do its work. The clinic broke ground the following March, on a lot behind the old company store, where the hardware shop's parking lot had once been, and Eli stood at the edge of the small crowd gathered for the groundbreaking, with a shovel he had no intention of using himself, on account of the ground being uneven enough that he didn't trust the leg on it, and let Ruth turn the first spade of dirt instead, because it had been her grandmother's story that started the whole search, and because, as she put it herself, at 78 years old a person had earned the right to a ceremonial shovel now and again. He funded a third thing too, smaller, more personal, that he didn't put Whitfield's name on at all. A transition house 2 counties over for veterans coming home the way he had, with nowhere steady to land and no clear next step, staffed by people who understood, because they'd lived it themselves, that the hardest part of coming home was rarely the physical wound. He thought, drafting the charter for that house, of Ochoa, the Marine 2 beds down at Walter Reed, who had taught him spades left-handed, and told him, on a bad night neither of them had forgotten, that grief didn't run on anybody's schedule. He tracked him down through a veterans network, after nearly 5 years of silence, and asked, somewhat awkwardly, whether he'd consider running the place day to day. Ochoa laughed, disbelieving, down the phone line, then went quiet for a long moment, then said yes before Eli had even finished explaining the full scope of what he was asking. You remember what I told you, that one bad night, Ochoa said, about the grief and the schedule. I remember every word of it. Been carrying it around for years, waiting to find a use for it. Well, Ochoa said, now you've built the place where I get to say it to 100 other guys, instead of just you. Feels like the whole thing's come full circle in a way I never would have guessed. Back in that ward. He named it for Danny Ferris, and flew Rosa and her daughter out for the dedication, and stood beside them on a windy afternoon while a chaplain, considerably less tired-eyed than the one Eli remembered from a field hospital a lifetime ago, said a few words about service and sacrifice that Eli mostly didn't hear, too busy watching a girl he'd never met, 9 years old now, run her hand along a brass plaque bearing her father's name for the first time in her life. Rosa found him afterward, by the parking lot, while her daughter ran ahead toward the car, with the particular boundless energy of a 9-year-old who had just been told there would be ice cream on the way home. She hugged him, quick and fierce, the way she always had on their brief visits over the years, and held on a beat longer than usual this time. He talked about you, you know, she said, pulling back. Before, said you were the only guy in the platoon he trusted to actually listen, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He was better at that than I ever was. He was better at a lot of things than he ever got the chance to prove. Rosa looked back at the building behind them, Danny's name catching the last of the afternoon light. This is a good thing you built, Eli. I don't know how to thank you for it properly, so I'm just going to say it plain. Thank you. Don't need thanking, just needed doing. Eli watched her daughter climbing into the back seat, already asking about the ice cream, blessedly, mercifully unaware of the full weight of what the day had meant. He'd have done the same for me. Better, probably. Would have figured out how to build it faster and with less fuss. Rosa laughed, wet and sudden, and wiped her eyes with the back of one hand. That does sound exactly like him. He kept Danny's dog tags in that nightstand drawer for years afterward, the way he had since the hospital, but he found he no longer needed to open the drawer quite so often to remember why he'd kept them in the first place. Some debts, he'd come to understand, didn't get paid off so much as carried forward, transformed into something that outlived the man they were originally owed to. And he found, standing in a gravel parking lot 2 counties from Ashford Hollow watching a little girl argue happily with her mother about chocolate versus vanilla, that carrying it forward had turned out to be lighter than he'd ever expected grief to feel. The chapel itself reopened on a bright Sunday in October, almost exactly a year after Eli had signed a $1 deed under fluorescent lights that hummed louder than the clerk's radio. The roof was whole. The floor no longer sagged. The stained glass had been cleaned by a specialist Ruth had personally vetted, and threw color across the restored pews in patterns nobody in 3 generations had seen clearly enough to appreciate. 311 people, or near enough to it, filled a sanctuary built for exactly that many, and Ruth Anders, 79 now, sat in the second pew from the front, left side, in the exact spot her own mother had once occupied, and cried through most of the short service without once looking embarrassed about it. The whole of Ashford Hollow seemed to have turned out, and a good number of people from beyond it besides, Franklin Osei among them, and Priya Castellano, and Professor Wren with a graduate student in tow, taking careful photographs for the university archive. And even Marion, who Eli had never once seen out of a tailored suit, wearing a simple green dress and looking, for the first time since he'd known her, less like an attorney and more like a woman who had genuinely come to care about how the story turned out. Furlong and Ed Merchant and Doris from the county annex sat together near the back, and Marjorie from the Historical Society had brought, framed and matted, a full-size reproduction of the original 1911 dedication notice from the Ashford Hollow Beacon, which now hung just inside the restored front doors where every visitor would see it first. Eli sat 2 rows back, on the same side, in the pew where his grandfather used to sit, with Callie on one side of him and Jonah on the other. Dom and his wife just behind them. Hollis and his own family 2 rows further back, having become, over the course of a long, strange year, something closer to a friend than either man had expected. Wade read a short passage aloud, his voice only shaking a little. Diane Whitfield Cross and her father sat near the front as honored guests, invited by name, and when the small brass plaque behind the altar was unveiled, Anne Whitfield and Corwin's initials catching the afternoon light through glass that had waited 100 years to be properly seen again. Diane's father wept openly, and nobody in that chapel thought less of him for it. Partway through the short service, Jonah, 7 and increasingly less inclined to sit still through anything longer than a cartoon, leaned over and tugged Eli's sleeve. "Uncle Eli," he whispered, not quite as quietly as he seemed to think he was whispering. "Are you rich now?" Eli considered the question with the same seriousness he'd have given a much harder one. "I've got money now I didn't used to have," he said, quiet, matching the boy's register. "Rich is a different thing, though. Rich is more about what you do with it than what you've got." "What'd you do with it?" "Built a doctor's office so nobody in this town has to drive an hour when they're sick. Built a school fund so kids around here get a real shot at whatever they want to be. Built a house for soldiers who need somewhere steady to land when they come home." Eli glanced down at him. "And I fixed up this old chapel so your grandkids might sit in this same pew someday. Same as my granddaddy did. Same as I'm doing right now with you." Jonah considered this, with the grave concentration of a child working through a genuinely difficult problem. "That's a lot of stuff for $1, he said, finally, and Eli had to press his lips together hard to keep from laughing out loud in the middle of the service. And Callie, catching the exchange, had to do the same. The town itself changed slower than any headline, but it changed. The hardware store hired 2 new clerks to keep up with contractors driving in for clinic and foundation work. A young couple who'd grown up in Ashford Hollow and left for Charleston a decade earlier moved back that spring. Drawn, they told Patty over coffee, by news of the clinic and a standing invitation Eli had put out to any local business willing to reopen its doors. The sign at the town line, the one that had been crossed out and repainted at least 4 times in Eli's memory, always lower, got repainted once more that autumn, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, with a higher number than the one it replaced. It wasn't a boomtown again, not the way it had been in Whitfield's day, and Eli never once pretended otherwise, to himself or to anybody else. But it was a town with a working clinic instead of a 40-minute drive to the nearest one, and a scholarship fund instead of a school that had closed for lack of a tax base, and a chapel with a whole roof instead of one more slowly collapsing reminder of everything the Hollow had lost. Small, steady, unglamorous progress, the kind that never made a headline on its own, and Eli found he preferred it that way. He'd had enough of headlines to last him a good while. Afterward, standing on the front steps in the cooling October light, while the town milled and talked below him, Eli thought about the level that had told him a wall wasn't settling, and the hollow sound a hammer had made against stone nobody else had thought to question, and the particular, stubborn certainty he'd felt signing a deed for a building everyone he knew had told him wasn't worth saving. He thought about Josiah Whitfield, dead of a fever 100 years before either of them had a chance to meet, who had spent the last years of his life building something he was never allowed to finish, and about Danny Ferris, who never got the chance to finish anything at all, and about his own leg, gone but not, in the end, the whole of what he'd lost that day, or the whole of who he'd become since. A promise didn't stop being a promise just because the man who made it ran out of time to keep it himself. It only waited, the way the chapel had waited, patient and hollow behind a wall nobody thought to question, for somebody willing to finish what had been started. Eli Cole had learned, the hard way, twice over now, that he was exactly that kind of man. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.